So the topic for this upcoming week in English 321 Sentences, Grammar, and Style is clauses. So first you should review Dr. Miller's video on kinds of sentences. In that video, Dr. Miller reviews two types of clauses, independent and dependent clauses. This is going to help us be able to identify whether a sentence is a simple sentence, a compound sentence, a complex sentence, or a compound complex sentence. In the second video for this week, I'm going to discuss then three types of dependent clauses. So, what is a dependent clause? How do we know that it's different from an independent clause? Well, it has a subordinate marker, okay? So, which types of sentences have dependent clauses? Dr. Miller has told us that they are included in complex and compound complex sentences. Now, there are three types of dependent clauses: adverbial clauses, adjectival clauses, and noun clauses. So how do we know what kind of dependent clause we're looking at? By its function, okay? We're going to return to some of the same questions we've asked when we were dealing with just single words to help us decide how a particular dependent clause is functioning, even though now it's a group of words. Why does this matter? Well, we need to know what kind of dependent clause a clause is, because it's going to determine how we diagram it, how we connect them, right? The dependent clause to its independent clause, because each one is showing us a different kind of relationship that's created between the independent and dependent clause. Our first type of dependent clause is an adverb clause or adverbial clauses, okay? Just like single word adverbs, they have the same function. They answer our adverbial questions: when, where, how, why, and to what extent. They're usually marked by what we call a subordinating conjunction. Remember Dr. Miller's lecture, subordinating conjunctions create an unequal relationship between clauses, a hierarchical relationship, right, whereby our dependent clause is less than our independent clause, okay? So you'll see an example of a sentence with an adverbial clause. Clayton will go to the movie when his mom gives him permission. We have two subject-verb relationships. The first, Clayton will go, is the independent clause. There's no subordinate marker. Our second subject-verb relationship is mom gives. We'll see a subordinate marker there, a subordinating conjunction when. So that's our dependent clause. We have a complex sentence because we have one independent clause and one dependent clause. Over to the left of your screen, you'll see how to diagram adverbial clauses. Your independent clause always, always, always goes above your dependent clause. The dependent clause goes below the independent clause and is shifted a little bit to the right, again to show that there is a hierarchical relationship, that it is less than our independent clause. And then we connect our two baselines for our independent clause and our dependent clause by a dotted line that has our subordinating conjunction on it. Now here I've connected them from verb to verb because our dependent clause, when his mom gives him permission, is modifying when he will go. So I'm connecting it to the verb will go. Our second kind of dependent clause is an adjectival clause. Again, just like single word adjectives, these clauses answer our adjective questions: what kind, which one, how many, or whose. They're often marked with a relative pronoun. Relative pronouns we'll say more about in class, but they act as double agent words. They're subordinate markers, and they also connect a pronoun to its antecedent in the independent clause. An example: Clayton remembers a time when he could only see G-rated movies. We have two subject-verb relationships again here. The first, Clayton remembers, is our independent clause. It has no subordinate marker. It's going to be diagrammed on top. When he could only see G-rated movies, we have our second subject-verb relationship. He could see. It has a marker, when. So we have that dependent clause. We have another complex sentence here with one independent clause and one dependent clause. Once again, we're going to diagram our dependent clause below our independent clause off to the right. Now, because this is adjectival, you'll see that the subordinate marker when, right, is connecting, telling us something about the time, right? Which time? So we're going to create our dotted line between time and our relative pronoun when. That's where our main relationship is between this independent clause and the dependent clause. So we've drawn a dotted line connecting our relative pronoun and the dependent adjectival clause to the noun that it's modifying or replacing, time, in the independent clause. Our final type of dependent clause is a noun clause. They do nouny things just like single word nouns. They can serve as subjects, predicates, predicate nominatives rather, direct objects, objects of the preposition, and appositives. Now they have a much larger group of markers, okay? Things like expletives such as whether, interrogative pronouns like who, in addition to some of the things we've already seen. So some examples: that he cares about others is his strength. We'll come back to that to talk about how to diagram these, but in this sentence the dependent noun clause is the subject. His strength is that he cares about others. In this sentence, it's the predicate nominative. I know that he cares about others, the direct object. I know who or what. His strength that he cares about others is admirable, an appositive, a non-restrictive appositive. I would dislike him except that he cares about others, the object of the preposition except. So let's look at our diagram. Again, we have a group of words that's doing a nouny thing, okay? So we're going to put it on a pedestal, back to our pedestals, okay? So this one, because that whole noun clause is serving as part of the independent clause, it's embedded within it, right? So we won't have two separate baselines like in adverbial and adjectival clauses where one is function as a modifier for the other. In this case, we have to put the noun clause on the main line using a pedestal because it's embedded within the independent clause, okay? So again, we have two subject-verb relationships. He cares is our first one, and our second one is that whole noun clause that he cares about others is, okay? So when we look at this, you'll see we have our noun clause on a baseline, on a pedestal, serving as the subject of the independent clause. And we usually float our markers when it comes to noun clauses, right? They're not serving any purpose within the actual dependent clause, like a relative pronoun is in an adjectival clause, nor do we have a way to connect them to yet another diagram line. So we usually float them above the noun clause. I know that this is a lot. We'll do plenty of practice in class this week, so don't stress out. But ultimately, we come back to the same question. How are you going to know how to diagram a dependent clause? Well, you're first going to need to know how it functions to determine if it's adverbial, adjectival, or a noun clause, and then you'll be able to diagram it. See you guys this week.